Well, we're back with my friend Jonathon Van Maren, who's the communications director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. This is part 2 of our little series kind of discussing Abolish Human Abortion. So if you haven't heard part 1, stop now, because this isn't going to make very much sense. We are building on foundation that has already been built before. So we were talking about how AHA had kind of gone away, or at least seemed to kind of drop off the radar around 2015. Mm-hmm. And then recently they've come back because they've been pushing a lot of state bills that are trying to basically ban all abortions, but would also have the unintended side effect of removing all the pro-life incremental bills that have actually effectively helped drop the abortion rate. Mm-hmm. And so now we sort of got to pay attention to them again. Also, I've been paying more attention just because they've been causing all kinds of problems, both in Oregon with my friends Oregon Right to Life, and also just frankly at the abortion clinic that Jacob on our team is trying to sidewalk counsel at, and that has become a big problem. So I want to jump back into and just kind of pick up where we left off, but we've got kind of multiple kind of subtopics that I want to get into this afternoon. So you start paying more attention as they start pushing these bills that are maybe well-intended, but would have really, really bad negative consequences.
Yeah, so that's where I basically re-engaged. So to back up, when we say they went away, it's the pro-life movement basically sort of like, okay, now we addressed right. Their ideology in 2015. We're not going to engage anymore. And Hunter really proved in the aftermath of that debate that he was a bad faith actor acting in bad faith. Yeah. The things he accused, his debater with on Facebook was just crazy. And so we sort of ignored them. He kind of got resurrected by attaching himself to Jeff Durbin of Apologia Studios, who does a lot of great stuff on other issues, but on the abortion issue seems to have more or less bought the snake oil that Hunter's selling. Yeah. He comes at it from a far more theological approach than a strategic approach. Some of the things he said about pro-life strategy are actually like viscerally embarrassing to listen to, because they just display a phenomenal ignorance of what's actually going on, right? These, if people just understood that these things are more complicated than they look, and not everything fits into a moral slogan that you could fit on the back of a bumper sticker, we'd all be a lot better off. But to make a point of what happened in the intervening years, the last 5 or 6 years, T. Russell Hunter is easily he's the Harold Camping of the anti-abortion movement, because he's constantly predicted that his movement was going to take off, and there was going to be, he said, and I know another pro-life big screenshots for thousands, tens of thousands of abolitionists, right, swarming major cities, going to put an end to this. Well, that hasn't materialized. Right. Sure, they had a rally, I think, at the State House in Oklahoma that had a couple of hundred people. Looked pretty big. That's far cry from what they said they'd have. But here's where they do the bait and switch, and they go back and forth, right? As on one hand, he'd say, well, even if we're a small group, right, God only wanted Gideon's 300 to defeat the enemy. But then when people kind of point out, hey, you said you were going to have a lot more people than you have now, then it's well, the pro-life movement is lying about us and holding me back. And so it's I thought that you only needed Gideon's 300 though. And now it's the pro-life movement's fault that you're failing. What happened to the providential aspect of all this, right? It's just the epistemology is just appalling. And there's no coherence or consistency to the way they respond to criticisms. They sort of one-off the criticisms, oh, good, I got that off my back, but it doesn't cohere with other things they've previously said, which anybody who listens to them, listen to a bunch of things they've said in a row, right? And it will become quite clear that this is just sort of a bit of a joke. So the one history I thought really bears mentioning for those listening is, even a lot of pro-lifers aren't fully aware of the history of the pro-life movement. And the history of the pro-life movement, we've got a half century under our belt now in North America. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that has occurred. So if you read Dr. Daniel K. Williams' book, Defenders of the Unborn, he's a professor at the University of West Georgia, and the book was published by Oxford University Press. The pro-life movement was initially a bunch of lefty hippie Catholics who cut their teeth on ban the bomb marches, who used the principles of Catholic solidarity and social justice and just applied them to the abortion debate, right? That's sort of the genesis of the movement. One of the books I think every American pro-lifer should read is Abortion Rites, Rites, by Marvin Olasky, which is a social history of abortion in America, to understand not just the emergence of the pro-life fight, but also the way abortion has been dealt with from the colonial period until now. It's the work is so good that despite the fact that he is a Christian, he's the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, he is cited by almost every pro-abortion writer I've read.
Wow.
in their academic studies. Like there's a book called Abortion and the American Imagination, which I read recently by a hardcore pro-abortion feminist. She cites Olasky. So that's how good his research is. And it provided some really useful context to, if you want to abolish abortion in America in 2021, you first need to understand the abolitionist movement and how that played out. You also have to understand the pro-abortion and pro-life movements. You need to understand how abortion's been viewed. You need to understand which laws targeted it and why. And I'm completely convinced that Hunter and his compatriots don't understand any of that. I don't want to say he hasn't read the book, because I don't know, maybe he has and just didn't understand it. But based on the things that he says, it really, really looks like he has not. So that book, very, very important. The way they drove down the abortion rate, the way that abortion was treated, why they predominantly prosecuted abortionists rather than the women getting abortions is fully explained by a couple of 100 years of history.
Yeah.
And then you look at the pro-life movement, let's say post-73. So you've got, like the hippie lefty Catholics who started us off on this. It was not drawn along neat ideological lines at all in the beginning. And actually the liberals were out ahead of the conservatives on this issue, like hands down, and the Catholics were ahead of the Protestants. So none of this fits very well into the sort of the AHA mantra. And then you have the 80s, and you got Francis Schaeffer's Christian Manifesto, which I know the abolitionists are a big fan of. One of their favorite quotes from Francis Schaeffer was, "Every abortion clinic should have a sign in front of it that says, 'Here by the permission of the church.'" And Francis Schaeffer really wanted to inject sort of an intellectual approach, but also a more radical political approach into American Protestantism, and largely succeeded. He partnered with Jerry Falwell, who with Dr. Dobson and a number of other people sort of formed what we know as the modern religious right. And then we have a movement in the 80s. There's a whole bunch of things happening at the same time. So you have the ongoing development of statewide right to life organizations. You have the development of national right to life continuing from the 1970s. National right to life is sort of a favorite hobby horse of Hunter and Durbin, et cetera. And like, for full disclosure to those listening, like I have problems with political groups that colonize pro-lifers for the GOP, as opposed to colonizing the GOP for pro-lifers. There's a distinction to be made there. I like what SB A-List does, which is like, if you're a Republican and you don't vote the right way on abortion bills, we're going to go after you because you are responsible for saving babies. We're not responsible for getting Republicans elected, but pro-lifers elected, which is why, for example, like SB A-List has put a lot of money into getting Democrats, pro-life Democrats like Dan Lipinski elected, right?
Yeah.
So just for full disclosure, I think that some of the political critiques made by the abolitionist folks are accurate. And I think that's what gives some of their stuff legs. It's because people hear things like, that makes sense to me. That is shady. I don't like that. So they ask some of the right questions and then collapse into having all of the wrong answers. And when we look at sort of the 1980s and how the pro-life movement developed, right? The idea that abortion should be sort of eradicated in one fell swoop, very much not a new thing. The Human Life Amendment, which was supported at one point by President Ronald Reagan, was supposed to do precisely that. And then, towards the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, a lot of people despaired of that happening, and that was kind of shelved. A lot of people have just forgotten that ever happened, right? Like I noticed with the personhood debate and stuff, it's like Abraham Lincoln, my favorite incrementalist, once said, "History serves to remind us that our new ideas aren't new and aren't ours." And which is why the history of the pro-life movement is so important, because the ideas put forward by the abolitionists are almost without exception not new and not theirs. And the best example of the explicitly religious approach to this would be Operation Rescue. So Operation Rescue, not the current organization that works on exposing what's going on behind closed doors in abortion clinics, run by Troy Newman out of Wichita, Kansas.
Right.
I'm talking about the rescue movement beginning in the 80s, which was begun by Randall Terry, who was, I believe, started as a Pentecostal, ended up becoming Catholic later on. Started by him, who's 27 years old, and he actually didn't invent the idea of rescue. The idea of physically putting yourself in between those seeking abortions in the clinic was actually just the application of Catholic social justice and solidarity. And it was John Kavanagh O'Keefe and a bunch of Catholics who started this, doing solo rescues long before Randall Terry sort of popularized this as a mass movement. And just to give our listeners an idea of how massive of a movement this was, we're talking 70,000 arrests in less than 10 years, which is roughly double the number of arrests during the American Civil Rights Movement. Now, there might be some people saying like, okay, come on, like this is such a dumb idea. I can't believe people actually put themselves physically in front of abortion clinics. Like historical context is very important here, right? Like the civil rights movement was like 15 years old at that point. So nonviolent direct action had just worked in America to end on injustice. And so like in 2021, it's really easy to armchair quarterback them and say like, I can't believe those people with the crazy perms and the stonewashed jeans, you know, are getting, you know, arrested in front of a clinic that looks so uncool. No, they were, if you read Randall Terry's book, Operation Rescue, which for historical purposes, it's interesting. I don't think it's important for pro-lifers to read, but like, if you want to understand their movement on their own terms, you should read it. Like it was really like, okay, that worked. We're going to try this. And people also have to realize that like, when I say a movement got triggered, I mean, almost nobody living has seen anything like that unless they were part of the rescue movement. Like maybe the American March for Life, where, you know, hundreds of thousands of people show up once a year will be a crowd equivalent, but like 70,000 arrests. You had like the siege of Atlanta, where pro-lifers descended from all over the country, blockaded abortion clinics. People went to jail for months because they wouldn't give their identification. They identified as Jane Doe or John Doe in solidarity with the nameless unborn who were being killed in abortion clinics, right? Like these people were deeply devout, they were deeply committed, and they were enacting a strategy that was, one, historically strategic from their perspective, and from their perspective, looking back, seemed very, very reasonable. And then also it was profoundly theological. And this is where this whole idea of abortion as sin and abortion requiring a repentance, both personal, cultural, national, it's not Hunter's invention. Like the way Randall Terry and many of the rescue movement people, and I've interviewed most of these people about it because I'm so fascinated by this element of our movement. They actually called, they talked about the doctrine of blood guiltiness. I believe Troy Newman has written an entire book on the doctrine of blood guiltiness, like in scripture where people are guilty of blood. And that by interposing yourself in between the people trying to get an abortion and the abortionist, that was a physical act of repentance. It's always struck me as odd that this was so embraced by Protestants, because it strikes me as an oddly Catholic penance sort of view. I'm not saying that in a pejorative way. I find it really interesting that this sort of physical act of repentance took off, and in such massive numbers.
Do you have a sense for, just because I know we've got, you know, some younger listeners, like they haven't thought a lot about even, you know, the early rescue movement. Like I love this kind of charitable thing that you just said, where you're just like, look, they were doing something based on another movement and that had been successful, like in the not so recent past. I love that. Can you help explain, or do you have a sense for why didn't it work? Why did it work for the civil rights movement, but it didn't? Was it just because the topic was different, or like what was the difference there?
No, like so half a dozen reasons. And I can.
That's all.
And I'll briefly, half a dozen that I can articulate in a sort of podcast palatable form.
Okay.
The first one I would say is that the civil rights movement had the benefit of, like, the people who were being oppressed were the ones getting arrested. The visuals were much more powerful. And so just, you know, the babies couldn't speak for themselves, which is why people had to get arrested for them. Like, it's interesting that Babies Are Murdered Here crowd, which is kind of partnered with the abolitionists, although they've had some falling out. You know, they have, like, there's like, we should call abortion murder. Like, the slogan of the rescue movement was, if abortion is murder, act like it. Like, that was their actual slogan. Then we have Bill Clinton basically cracked down on with the FACE Act, the Freedom of Access to Abortion Clinics entrances, which basically started slapping people in jail for a long period.
It was now a federal crime. Yeah.
And again, just to give an idea of why people were so hopeful the rescue movement would work, there were judges that were declining to sentence pro-lifers because they were sympathetic early on. Like, early on, there was like really solid indications that their defense of breaking the law, which is that they were doing it on behalf of human lives, might actually work, because a couple of judges signaled like that they were very sympathetic to that argument, right? So again, like, if I place myself there and I've got a judge being like, no, fair enough, I can see that, you know, I'd be like, this is actually going to work, right? This is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. This seems so obvious. Keep in mind, again, abortion had only been legal for like a decade, right? It was a fresh thing, right? It was like, we this is brand new. We just got to roll this back. We got to stuff the genie back in the bottle, right? So the Freedom of Access to Abortion, a great book to read on this is called Wrath of Angels, The American Abortion War by James Risen. It's a really blunt analysis of what took place, and it talks about the rise of violence in the late 80s and early 90s initially, which was abortion clinic bombings and then a handful of murder of abortionists.
Yep.
I've several of the heads of Operation Rescue, like Jeff White of California, has explicitly stated, like, I don't like everything in the book, but that's the way it was. He, in fact, is the one who recommended it to me. And he's not always portrayed, very lovingly in the book. So it's sort of endorsed by some of the people who were there.
Yeah.
That really hurt the pro-life movement.
Yes.
The book actually makes clear that none of the leaders of Operation Rescue endorsed violence, that the rescue movement was inherently a nonviolent practice. However, the fact that people blocking abortion clinic entrances coincided with abortion clinic bombings was enormously damaging for PR purposes, and basically transformed public perception from, pro-lifers as people getting billy clubbed by cops and having their arms broken with nunchucks and victims of police brutality to aggressors who were part of the same crowd that were firebombing clinics and, shooting Bart Slepian and that sort of thing.
Right.
And there are a couple of people who participated in rescues that were part of the violence. So James Kopp being the most famous, the sniper who was convicted, I believe, for one killing, but was probably guilty of several, is still in jail in New York State. And he actually, his nickname in the rescue movement was the Atomic Dog, and he would, put glue in abortion clinic locks and stuff like that. So he wasn't a leader, but he had a peripheral connection. Like, look, when you've got a movement of tens of thousands of people, you can't exactly, run a background check on all of them.
Right.
And I think movements that deal with injustice are inevitably going to attract some people who lapse towards extremism, which again, like the pro-life movement didn't understand why the media was treating them so differently, because like the civil rights movement had the exact same thing, right? You had the Malcolm X wing of the movement, you had the MLK wing of the movement, you had those who said violence is the only means that will actually end this, you had others who said nonviolence is the most powerful tool we possess. Right. And so the pro-life movement, like every other social justice movement, has had elements that got frustrated with the pace of change and said, like, this is the route that we're going to take. A hugely significant reason that the rescue movement failed as well is because of the difference in how the media has treated pro-lifers versus how they treated civil rights activists, right? I've often said that the pro-life movement is the very first social justice, very first human rights movement that does not have the support of the media. And it actually has the media actively working against them, right? There is no lie too egregious for the press to print. And I know this, I've seen myself written about in newspapers. I'm like, I was there. That was me. Right. This does not reflect me or what happened there. Right.
Right.
And so that was another really big reason. And then, do you know what? There was just like the fact that a movement that big was impossible to lead and consolidate properly. And so it did. There was obviously towards the end there was absolute infighting. So there were people who broke under the strain. There was some drinking and some divorces. This is all in James Rissen's book, so I'm not sort of spilling the beans on friends, which I wouldn't do. And that was part of it. Like, consider the enormous strain of somebody in their 20s leading a movement that's resulting in tens of thousands of arrests, and just it's pro-lifers have to be very, very careful because our movement's nuts, and far better men than we have burned out trying to face this day in and day out. And the rescue movement is also, I think, an example of how that happened. And so you had a whole bunch of leadership swaps in short order. Randall Terry, and then there was Keith Tukey, and then there was argument, like different wings of the rescue movement nationwide disagreed on the best path forward. So they kind of broke off and split off. The one thing I would say the rescue movement did do is a huge chunk of today's current leadership was shaped and formed by rescue. The sort of spine of a lot of pro-life groups that exist today. Their leaders were either formed or radicalized by or otherwise brought into the movement through the work of rescue in the 80s, which, having been born in the 80s, is now a tad longer than I'd like to admit. But the really important thing, I think, for the abolitionists who were like, we need to call this murder, we need to all this, none of this is new, guys. The human life movement in the 80s, it didn't fail because we would call it, life from conception. It failed for political reasons outside of our control. Right. Calling abortion murder, there were 70,000 arrests under the slogan, if abortion is murder, act like it. The idea of acting out against abortion as an act of repentance, you didn't make that up either. probably goes back to the Catholics if you read Daniel K. Williams' book. But if you want to look at it from the fundamentalist evangelical Protestant side of things, that was the rescue movement. So again, history serves to remind us that our new ideas aren't new and aren't ours. And it does frustrate me sometimes that there's a huge dearth in the pro-life movement of knowledge of the pro-life movement. I find that a lot of us are actually more familiar with like MLK or Wilberforce or, other sort of titans of human rights movement than our own movement. And our own movement it's messy, it's complex,
yes.
Because people are messy and complex, but it's both inspiring. It's like deeply fascinating, and should be engaged on its own terms and should inform what we do now. The big point I want to make for anybody listening is that critiquing people with hindsight is like the easiest trick in the book, and nobody should do it. If I look at myself and put myself in the 80s, I would legit be one of the people radicalized and getting arrested in front of the doors without doubt. 100%. That's very much my disposition, and it's very much the way I feel about abortion. And being told there's something you can physically do is incredibly empowering for people, because I think the thing that frustrates almost every pro-lifer is the helplessness of knowing babies are being killed in your city, and there's nothing that you can physically do. It's especially frustrating for men who want to just be able to like, can I lift something? Can I do something? Like, how can I address this? And it's like, no, you just have to talk to somebody for an hour.
Yeah.
And hope it works.
Let me ask you an annoying question that is in some people's minds right now, and I just want you to have the chance to respond to it, because I know it's sort of a straw man, but it's just so easy for people to get in their heads. Right. You just said something like, "Don't critique with hindsight pro-lifers in the past." And I think some people are like, yeah, but you're critiquing AHA for the last 2 episodes of this podcast, including stuff that was going on at least 6-7 years ago. So help people understand the distinction between what you mean about critiquing past pro-lifers versus what we're talking about here with AHA.
2 key distinctions. The first one I'd point out is that they're not pro-life and be offended that you call them that.
Right.
So
I just slandered them.
I actually do have a rule that I don't publicly critique other people in the movement. Privately, I've had hours-long conversations with people from almost every group about different tactics and strategies. But publicly, I won't. I think that's an in-house debate. It should be a debate, but it should also be in-house. However, that only applies to good faith people working in good faith, as I emphasized in the previous episode. And I do not believe. I believe some of the people who have recently joined the abolitionist movement have joined in good faith for good faith reasons. Like there are several new additions to Hunter's coterie that I think have been genuinely persuaded by some of the arguments, which I think are like not nuanced. I think they're simplistic. I think they border on slander based on what they say about those they disagree with. However, I would say that some of the people who have recently sort of defected are doing so for good faith reasons. The arguments made by Hunter himself and some of the people who have been here for the sort of decade span that we're talking about, he is not a good faith actor, not acting in good faith, unless he has the memory of a goldfish.
Right.
So when he says, I haven't slandered people, sorry, man, I saw it. Like, I know this happened. When you say, I can't claim to understand their motives, but maybe the pro-life movement's happy that abortion is legalized in Ireland so they can extend their influence there. Like, what else am I supposed to call that, right? And so basically, if I disagree with you, I'm going to have an argument with you on the phone. If I see somebody say Josh Brown doesn't care about abortion, is evil and wicked, I'm going to call them out for that, because that's a bad faith argument being made by bad faith people.
Right.
And again, like if you watch the Liberator podcast, Hunter's sort of thing is like, yeah, people used to think I was so mean, and look, you're talking to me now, and I'm not a monster. I'm like, you know what? I'm sure you're a pleasant guy to have a beer with.
Sure.
But that doesn't change what you said. It doesn't change the clearly stated implications of your ideas. And it doesn't change the fact that you're a hack historian who refuses to play out historical scenarios to the conclusion that they actually reach when you're discussing strategy, right? Like with the Garrisonian abolitionism resulting in the Emancipation Proclamation of the American Civil War, and then saying, we're Garrisonian abolitionists and we're going to do this, but we're not going to play it all the way out. It's like using half the history to make half your strategy, and just it's choose your own adventure. It's a surprise about how this whole thing ends. Which it is. I don't claim to actually know how that would play out. I have no idea how exactly an abolition bill would play out. I suspect that it would do what a lot of the pro-lifers suspect would, which is in White Buffalo, the regulations it would get overturned in court. It would get blocked by the courts, just like Alabama's recent bill did, just like the 18-week abortion ban
injunction
in Arkansas just did, right? So it's not even like you can just ignore the Supreme Court. It wouldn't even get that far. And then you're left with sort of like the most Planned Parenthood friendly state in the union, because you've wiped off all the regulations that were carefully passed, right? I suspect that makes the most sense to me based on the facts on the ground.
I agree.
There's a chance that I'm wrong. Like if there wasn't lives at stake, I'd love to see this play out in one state, just so we actually would have an idea of what that would look like. But it's just, there's too much to risk, right? I believe these abortion regulations save lives. Let me address one other thing the abolitionists will say if they listen to this podcast, and I'm sure their ears are itching, is I know one of them directly opposed, what was it, the heartbeat bill? It was an ultrasound bill, I believe, by saying, like, look, doctors can misuse it, they can ignore it. Like, that's all true. Every law, like people get around it, people subvert it, people don't listen to it. That doesn't mean it doesn't, just because it doesn't work for everybody all the time, doesn't mean it doesn't work for some of the people some of the time. And some of the time, we're talking about actual babies' lives. So and
it's also helping the conversation, that there's a national conversation that's happening about that bill, which can be helpful. So
here's another kind of idiotic thing where they have it both ways, right? It's like the reason we need a bill that explicitly calls like abolishes abortion across the board is because laws are educational. And so the existence of a law like that educates people on abortion being a bad thing that should be bad, which I obviously agree with. However, that is also like the whole reason, like, for a pain-capable ban is because it triggers a cultural conversation about how horrific abortion is. It draws attention to the humanity, and everybody passing those laws know that they're going to get stopped cold in court. So a lot of them are getting passed, unless it's a trigger ban. These laws are being passed often for explicitly educational reasons. I sometimes wonder how many pro-life legislators would be as eager to pass these bills if Roe was down and they had to actually defend the implementation of them. I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect there's some that are just trying to score points with a really big constituency. As a pro-life person, I take it as a compliment that they think that we're powerful enough to be pandered to. Like it's not a bad sign when politicians think that they need to pander to you, as long as you know what you're getting and you're realistic about it. So yeah, pro-life laws are very educational, just like an abolish human abortion law could be educational, as long as it doesn't wipe all the other laws off the books. And a good example of how laws are educational is if you look at what happened in Poland. In Poland, when communism ended in the early 90s, the communists had kind of sort of, thrown the gates wide in abortion for decades. And they immediately restricted abortion enormously. And they've been successively passing laws in the ensuing decades, restricting abortion more and more and more, down to the point where in Poland, there's only like roughly there's 1,000 abortions a year. Most of them performed for eugenic reasons. Those eugenic reasons have now been declared unconstitutional by the Polish High Court. The interesting part of this, though, is that the number of people who support abortion for, say, financial reasons, social reasons, etc., has gone down by double digits year over year from the 90s until now. So like the media narrative of there's an abortion revolution going on actually doesn't apply. Polish people have become more pro-life. And what the experts, the pro-choice, the pro-abortion experts have said is it's because law is a teacher.
Yeah.
And when it's like, abortion's wide open, that teaches you abortion is an action of so little consequence, it doesn't need regulation.
Right.
Whereas even putting laws in incrementally increases the view and the belief that this is a very serious matter that needs to be taken very seriously.
Yeah. So speaking of the laws, I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to ask about something, and you referenced this very quickly in the last episode, but I want to talk a little bit more about it now. There's this one of the many ways that AHA tends to talk very differently than, roughly the rest, well, not the rest of the pro-life movement, the pro-life movement, because they're not in the pro-life movement. But the rest of us, the people like you and me, is in their sense that, like, if they could get what they wanted, it sounds like they would not only have legal consequences for doctors who do abortions, but they would have legal consequences for women that have illegal abortions, which is just like not where the pro-life movement has been for lots of reasons. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that, but like, give me a sense of, like, is that correct? Do I have that right?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because, like, again, here's sort of like Hunter and the pro-aborts holding hands on this. They think that the fact that it's the position of almost every mainstream pro-life group that the laws passed protect the preborn and prosecute the abortionists. That's traditionally been the legal approach. And again, this is an approach that dates all the way back.
Yeah, before Roe versus Wade, yes.
Long before. So again, there isn't really a historical precedent for what you're saying. And there's really good reasons for that, which I'll get to. I'll say a couple of things. One, there's a couple of abolitionists who were just like way too enthused about constantly talking about women getting punished, which I'm not going to ascribe motive. I just find it unseemly. That's all. I don't know why you would join the movement to fight abortion and then camp out on the topic of getting to punish women afterwards so much. It doesn't make sense to me. There are people, I'll state, and you might disagree, but like I have met people doing activism on campus that know what abortion is, know what's killing a baby, and should probably be in jail for the cavalier fashion in which they've had like 3-4 abortions and they're openly admit, I'm killing a baby and I don't care, right? But my experience on the streets, having had thousands upon thousands of conversations, and the data backs this up in Canada, the United States, and Europe, is that the level of coercion and pressure in the abortion discussion is almost omnipresent, right? Frederica Matthews Green, who's Orthodox, has a famous quote where she said, a woman wants abortion like a fox caught in a trap wants to chew off his leg. Well, legalized abortion has basically created a culture in which men get to tell women to start chewing and walk away, right? Like we're starting to understand more and more in the era of Me Too as well, that the subtle ways in which pressure and coercion exist in various circumstances. Now, again, just because, bad faith people will interpret Americans in bad faith, I'm not defending the Me Too movement. I think it's a re-implementation of Christian principles without redemption. That being said, some of the discussion I think has been incredibly helpful.
Really good stuff have come out of the Me Too movement. Yes.
I think the discussion of power dynamics that we've discussed is very important and directly applicable to the abortion debate. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to the reasons people have abortion, they're complicated. So for me, they seem to want law to reflect precisely how they think the world should be. As a conservative and as somebody who looks at the development of law, my personal view is that abortion laws are both educational and they're also utilitarian. The utility of a law targeting abortion is to educate people, protect the preborn from conception. It's also to reduce abortion to the greatest amount, right? And so what is the best way to do that? And again, that is a good faith argument people can have in good faith. Somebody could come to me with an argument saying, prosecution in these circumstances, with jail time in these circumstances would be the best way to reduce the abortion rate. And I say, I'm listening. And if you're right, I'll get on board. That is not the way it has worked in the past, however. And the best comparison I have is so here in Canada, under the last Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, there was a debate surrounding prostitution. In Canada, prostitution had been illegal and women were prosecuted for selling sex. And what they found, however, was there was so much coercion and pressure and violence involved that they could charge the woman, she'd, pay a fine and get out and walk right back into the arms of her pimp or her sex trafficker, and it would perpetuate the cycle because we just didn't totally understand everything that was going on. So in order to eliminate prostitution to the greatest extent possible under law, Canada adopted what's referred to as the Nordic model because it's a model that was pioneered in the Scandinavian countries, which prosecutes buying sex and not selling sex. Which essentially means if you're a John or a pimp or a sex trafficker, like if you go to a prostitute and purchase money and the cops bust down the door, like the guy who bought the sex is getting arrested, not the woman selling it.
Right.
And that has had a tremendous effect in reducing rates of prostitution across the board. And the law isn't saying, by the way, prostitution is a good moral thing to do. What they're saying is that this approach is the most effective approach because so much coercion, because so much pressure is all involved in these things. This is the best approach.
Are they making both only a pragmatic argument, or are they also making because I feel like I've heard people when describing laws like that have sometimes also made a principled argument that something like this is more just for the women involved or something like that. Are they making both of those arguments?
Yes, they also would make the moral argument where they would say that like punishment has to fit the crime. I agree with that, but I just disagree fundamentally with them on what kind of law does both the educational job as well as the job of reducing and making sure we don't catch innocent people in the net. I have personally met many people forced into abortions that under the sort of law they're proposing, they would have ended up in jail. Right. I'm interested in the fewest number of babies being killed and in laws that accomplish that. We can have a good faith agreement on which laws accomplish that best.
Right.
I would agree with them that the law should say that human beings have the right to life. But like the way law works, like it's just, it's great if you want to have your, woe ones, you wicked ones inserted into laws. But like, guys, it's a little bit more complex and nuanced than that. Like,
right.
Part of me, let's do this. Like, this sounds really good. Like Hunter can be quite a skilled rhetorician because of like the phraseology he chooses to use, which is very intentional. But like, it's just, I also miss being 19 and knowing everything. But then but like at a certain point, you just realize the world is just far more complicated than that. Yeah. And so my approach to the legal question is how does law most effectively enshrine the rights of the preborn? How does it effectively condemn abortion as murder in the legal sense? And reduce abortions to the greatest extent possible, especially in an era of the abortion pill and things like that. So that's my approach to the legal question. They would basically say that if women aren't punished, this is somehow unjust. I'm like, I just don't agree with that necessarily. Yeah, I'd rather 100 guilty people get away than one innocent person get prosecuted. And so right now,
I agree with that.
I am open to anybody who's listening who has a better argument. My approach right now is what I call the Nordic model. To abortion law. And by the way, there are some significant pro-life leaders who also disagree with me on this and would be on Hunter's side on this. So this is not a monolithic topic. This isn't pro-life versus abolitionist. There are differing views, but I'm just explaining my views. And I do think their approach to almost every issue highlights the fact that their approach is sort of defined by being simplistic. And I think that's true in their moral theological approach. I think it's true in their strategic approach, their historical approach, and also in their legal approach. Like, just because it's intuitive doesn't necessarily mean it translates into the arena you want it to, right? It's like, well, if that woman had an abortion and said she like loves abortion, she should be prosecuted because she killed a baby, right? It's like, well, we can't just make a law that says if you say X, Y, Z, let's just do this. Like, maybe we can, but like it's really complicated, right? It's why people work together on creating laws. It's why we studied the intended effects of laws. It's why in the 90s you had a crime bill. It's not like the things that the crime bill included weren't already illegal. It's because some people thought that different prosecution, different punishment, different jail sentences would reduce crime here. Like this is an ongoing discussion that will never be over, which is what is the best judicial approach to reducing the crime to the greatest amount possible. I agree with them that abortion should be a crime. I just disagree with them based on my research into the history of abortion law and abortion in the United States. That's the best approach to doing it. And I find some of them kind of unseemly in how enthused they are about talking about punishing women. Maybe it's because they think it's sort of a gotcha. And I know they've gone after some pro-life leaders being like, oh, why don't you debate us on this? So maybe it's just they think it's like a really cute way of saying, look, pro-lifers don't care about abortion that much. Maybe
it could be.
But just to put the full range of options on the table, to be fair, but I find it weird, right? Working in the pro-life movement is not a super fun job. It sucks that the job exists. So to get involved and then that's the hill you want to camp out on, it just seems strange to me.
Their moral theology and everything is super simplistic. It's also just frustrating. I mean, this is like part of the reason we started here is where we wanted to help the whole pro-life movement kind of go up a rung on the intellectual ladder and be more nuanced and less simplistic. And I think like the effect of your work has done that too. A lot of your writings are just very, very nuanced. They force people to think more clearly, which is why I like reading that stuff. And so it's just frustrating to see like people almost like effectively trying to get pro-life people to think more simplistically and not with more nuance.
And like, the thing is too, with so much information and disinformation and coming at you from a million directions, like simplistic ideology and simplistic approach is deeply satisfying to me as well.
Yes.
Right? Like it's like, yes.
It makes you feel good. I'm the winner. They're the bad guy. I'm the hero. Yeah.
And again, that's where like the effectiveness goes back and forth, because some people might like say like my approach outside an abortion clinic is the most effective way. It's like, oh, but you didn't have any turnaways or any saved babies. But it's the right biblical approach, right? So let's switch back and forth, right? So,
yes.
Well, I might not be effective, but I'm right, and that's good enough. It's well, I didn't join the pro movement to be right, although I'd like to be. I joined the movement to save babies, and the only thing that I won't do to save babies is evil. Now, they would obviously disagree, because I'm sure that if any of them listened to this interview, they're going to think that much of my position is evil. But for me, the question is, how do we get to that point? And the answers are very complicated. Hungary, for example, is a fascinating case study of how a family-oriented economy and policies that would be traditionally considered liberal have done dramatically reduce the abortion rate. Israel and the Netherlands have the same thing, which shouldn't surprise anybody who knows the history of the pro-life movement, because it was sort of started by liberals, in the early 70s. So yeah, there's different answers to a lot of these questions. Very few things about the pro-life issue are ideologically satisfying. Yeah. You meet 100 post-abortive women, and you'll find 100 different reasons they had abortions, and you're not going to find a law that eliminates all of those reasons or disincentivizes every one of them. You're just not. Yep. That isn't going to happen. And so I always feel like rigid ideology rushes into the vacuum created by ignorance. And that is kind of how I see a lot of the stuff put forward by Hunter and then Jeff Durbin of Apologia Studios. And I've avoided addressing him directly, but some of the things he has said about the pro-life movement are just not true. And he believes them to be true, but they just aren't. They're based on his ignorance of the movement. Also, picking a pro-life person who they think that they can, there's that one guy in Oklahoma who works for National Right to Life, who I actually disagree with quite significantly on a lot of things, who they always try to use and say, here is the representative of a huge, diverse, an incredibly disparate pro-life movement, and we are now going to explain why he is wrong and we are right, and we have appointed him the representative of the whole pro-life movement. It's that's nice, guys. But I'll make one other point, just because I'm ranting, so I just want to get this one off my chest. I've heard Hunter say abortion, but how long does that be? I'm so sick of this. What do you mean you're so sick of this? You just got here, man. In the pro-life movement, we are like the kids on a block still. Right. Okay. So people like Joe Scheidler, who just died, in the harness in his 90s, he gets to say, "I'm so sick of legal abortion." Yes. We haven't earned those stripes yet. You just got here. You made some memes. You said a whole bunch of stuff to a whole bunch of people. You basically came up with a less effective knockoff of the rescue movement's ideology. And they're like, "I'm so frustrated that abortion's still legal." I'm just like, dude, man, you're gonna flame out, because I know a hero who just passed away in his 90s after fighting abortion his whole life. Granted, from Hunter's perspective, he would be objectively responsible for keeping abortion legal. So
he's probably the worst of them, right? Yeah.
No, if only Hunter had been born in time, he would have saved Joe Scheidler a couple of times.
I'm going to link to a podcast as far as just on the punishing women topic. It sounds like, I think, John, you and I basically agree, because and we've got a podcast that gets more into it, but it's basically I think moral culpability is complicated. And you could have 100 women who have abortions, and they plot out 100 different places on a spectrum of culpability, and some are very culpable. Yeah. Yeah. And
on one end, you're going to find people that from a moral perspective should be prosecuted.
Yeah.
But you can't create a legislation that addresses all of them. Yeah. And so we should err on the fact of not locking up guilty people, especially when it doesn't achieve the intended result of saving the baby to begin with. What is the utility of the law? So
completely agree. So let me shift you kind of towards one final topic as we begin to run out of time again. Is kind of the application, part of this. What do we do now? So you've got people like Jacob on our team again, who are trying to sidewalk counsel and are able to save a lot of babies when AHA is not there, or someone from Babies Are Murdered Here is there, or whatever. And so they're seeing this isn't working out. It's literally the number one question we're getting from sidewalk counselors taking our course is, what do we do about whether it's someone literally from AHA or just someone who acts like someone from AHA with the bullhorns and yelling the verses and wearing weird costumes and whatever it is, and then you've also have Oregon Right to Life trying to figure out what do we do? These people are really aggressive. They keep on standing right in front of us, which, by the way, Jacob has experienced that too. Across the country in Atlanta, he's got people stepping right in front of him. So I don't know if this is they've sent out a memo, to stand right in front of people. But it's everyone's trying to figure out what to do about this. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we've said, and I'm just setting you up for, please fill in the gaps, because there is clearly more work to be done. So we have a whole module in the Sidewalk Counseling Masterclass on this. I think we call it something about, talking to alternative sidewalk counselors. It's sort of an attempt at a charitable label for us to put on a lot of different types of people. And it's you try to dialogue with them, try to go to lunch with them, try to learn more about them, find common ground. Thank you for being here. At least you're here and not on the couch somewhere where a lot of pro-lifers are. You're here. I love that. Let's talk about what method seems to be most effective. You're trying these different things. But I know that there are people who've tried those things and it's not worked. And the people are still they're stubborn and they're just going to keep on being there. And then sidewalk counselors are just very, very ineffective while they're there. So please tell me any wisdom you have, Jonathon, for the people who are,
This one's very difficult because there's a difference between an ideology and the individuals participating in it. I'm quite certain that if, say, Hunter listens to this, that he would say, I don't endorse blocking people. To be as charitable as possible to them. I know a bunch of people who have been sort of sucked in by the abolitionist ideology that would 100% oppose all the things that you said, because some things aren't ideology. It's just about etiquette and courtesy and just try not to be a prick when you're engaging with other human beings. That's just in general a good standard to have. And I know plenty of people inside that sort of big tent of the pro-life movement who would also do stuff like that. Right. I'm sure you've met them as well. Yeah. So part of this is part of your question is just how do you deal with difficult people who just I remember meeting one guy who volunteered with a couple of our projects, not in Canada, in the US for a while, who seemed to enjoy saying abrasive, rude things to people. And I was just it's not that if we put our views on paper, we might actually have a lot of common ground, but just it's not just look, if I could yell at somebody, don't kill your baby for XYZ reason, and they would kill their baby, I would do that thing. So I don't have an ideological opposition to that. I have an effective opposition to that because our job is to be the most effective at saving lives. And if being blunt is the way to do it, then I would do that. I just have not found that to be at all effective. And in fact,
not how people work, especially now.
Genuinely counterproductive. So if taking them out for a bunch of stuff like that doesn't work, my engagement with abolitionism is only happening because they're in the public sphere, once again, due to these laws, and they're strawmanning pro-lifers. They're accusing us of having the power to end abortion, but not utilizing it, of essentially by supporting, say, an abortion ban in 18 weeks, that we are legalizing abortion prior to 18 weeks, right?
As if it wasn't already legal.
It seems like simple stuff, right? They've explicitly said this. And so that, I'm responding to straw man, and I'm also responding because I believe that people are attracted to sort of simplistic cookie cutter, historical analogies that they feel will help them end abortion, which they genuinely want to do. I don't want to question that. Right. So if you know people who are really sucked in by it, I really do. Anybody who's involved in the pro-life movement, guys, I even find some articles then. The Gospel Coalition put out a great article on the rescue movement. It is really important to know the history of our movement so that we don't make their mistakes again, and so B, we know which ideas have already been used, and so C, we don't take credit for things that aren't our ideas. I remember coming up with what I thought was a genius idea in our own organization, and then getting all excited about this, and I did some mock-ups and I was talking with our team, and I was quite pleased. And then doing more research later on, finding out somebody had literally done the thing that I came up with, air quotes, 30 years ago, right? Looks like that. Unless you're the smartest, the most strategic person in every room, which I promise you you're not. There's always going to be somebody who thought of something first or is smarter than you. And the history of the movement it's really, really good for multiple reasons. It's inspiring. It's a great teacher. It helps us with strategy. And so there are some abolitionist people that I think would respond well to basically how you communicate with an angry pro-choice activist, right? Form common ground, have a discussion, ensure that they see you as human. Because I will say a bunch of these abolitionist people, again, probably not some of the specific people we talked about, but a bunch of them don't really see pro-lifers as other people, in that if rhetoric has consequences, if they genuinely believe that folks like me and you are responsible for abortion being legal, and that we make money off the corpses of preborn children, they're probably not dispositionally inclined to like us to start with.
Or want to hear what we have to say.
I think pro-lifers who are engaging with them need to understand that they see us as worse than abortion supporters in many instances, because we know abortion's wrong and are making money perpetuating strategies that keep abortion legal, when all we would have to do is, join Free the States, support an abolition bill, and this all could go away. But we can't, because the pro-life industry would then stop making money.
So what do you do with that? So what do you do when you want to try to reason with a person who is just predisposed to despise kind of where you're coming from?
It's interesting because I'm fairly certain that after this podcast airs, I will get offers from a couple of abolitionists who have podcasts to come on and discuss this with them.
Yeah, not happening.
No, there are one or two that I think are in good faith who have come along more recently. So there are one or two people who identify with the abolitionist ideology, who are genuinely persuaded by it, and I think are good faith actors acting in good faith. Mm-hmm. Most of them will defend Hunter, and they'll act like, it's just not true that he was mean before or that he was slanderous, etc. And that's the reason I won't engage, is because I trust them roughly as much as I trust the media.
Right.
Like when I do a media interview about abortion, I am saying every word with the full knowledge that they would like to take me out of context to make me look bad.
Yes.
And my experiences of watching Hunter engage with people previously, and especially his response to the debate he had with Greg afterwards, proved to me that is the way he at least has operated in the past. And then the only reason I listened to a couple of episodes of the Liberator podcast was to see if he had changed, because people grow up, people mature.
Yes.
I hope people don't judge me on every single thing I said 10 years ago.
Me too.
Because that would suck.
Yes.
And so there's a genuine chance he's just like, a person who was carried away in his passion, against abortion. He said a bunch of stuff and he regrets that stuff, and we're all going to move on, and we can just leave it alone. But when he especially said the thing that I don't want to question their motives, but like maybe American pro-lifers wanted to sell ineffective pro-life strategy to the Irish because it would be legalized there and that would extend their influence, his exact terms, right? Anybody who doesn't believe me, it's on their podcast. This was stated publicly. So listening to that, I'm like, oh, okay, so you're still not a good faith actor. Like, I can't actually have the discussion I'm having with you, but like, let's say antagonistic, where he's like, but this, and I'm like, but this, right? Like, we can't have that back and forth, because he's either so dishonest that I can't engage with him, or he doesn't understand what he's saying, in which case, what would be the point? And so, I won't engage with them. I will now have, because a lot of pro-lifers are asking me questions, this will be, I've done now, including this one, and 2 podcasts on them, just kind of going through the history and stuff like that. And those are the terms on which I'll engage it. You'll notice that I have not named any of the other abolitionist people by name, although I've read a lot of their stuff and I know them. And it's because I believe that the bad faith actor is Hunter. And that things he said are lies, and they're slanderous. And there are people that I know and love and am inspired by who do not deserve those accusations from somebody who, like myself, is a whelp in this movement still. There is nothing wrong with learning from the mistakes of other leaders. There is something deeply and profoundly wrong about disrespecting their sacrifice by accusing them of making money off the backs of preborn children and keeping it legal.
Absolutely.
There are people in this movement that I profoundly disagree with on enormous matters of strategy. Yep. There are people I think have done things that are genuinely counterproductive.
Yes.
But like, I hope somebody smacks me in the mouth if I ever say, they made money because babies were dying, and like that, that's disgusting, and I think it's beyond the pale, and it needs to be called out. Now, if Hunter wants to play the trick, it's like, that's not what I meant, they're just deeply misguided. I'm sure he thinks some of them are deeply misguided, but I'm sorry, like, what you say has obvious implications. Yeah. Sometimes they've been bluntly stated. So I know trying to nail him down on something like that is trying to nail Jello to a wall. But you know what, guys, you're gonna put the tenets of abolitionism in the show notes. You can watch the debate with Greg Cunningham and T. Russell Hunter, and hear Hunter speak for himself. And these are things he has said on the Liberator podcast. And so it's there. It's in the public sphere. I'm not discouraging people from listening to what he has to say. Feel free to go and fact check everything I've said.
But any final practical advice for the poor pro-life people who have been followers of our stuff that are just trying to figure out, what do we do about this now? Like what should they do? I'll ask you like a specific question. Like, should a pro-life organization, and I know multiple, who have gotten a bad reputation from, for example, like the pastors in the area who then don't want to work with them because they are assuming that all the pro-lifers are the same, and they see obnoxious protesters, whether it's Babies Are Murdered Here or AHA or someone else. And it's like, there's this problem. Like, should the pro-life group like actually specifically like be publicly distancing themselves from these people, or does that just end up looking gross? Like, what practical advice do you have?
So I think we should distance ourselves from specific behaviors. So like to put out a statement of disaffiliation is returning the favor, right? Look, the abolitionists are all over the place saying we're not pro-life. One of their hashtags is put an end to the pro-life movement.
Right.
And so I think it's charitable to them to retweet that sentiment and say they are correct. We are not with them. We don't approve of their tactics. We believe their tactics to be counterproductive. I would do everything up to questioning motive, which that's I think gross. I don't think, just because I think somebody's being a jackass doesn't mean I think they're not sincere about wanting to end abortion or save babies. I think some of them are as deeply misguided as they think me to be. So we're returning the sentiments to each other. So I think that releasing a public statement, distancing ourselves from tactics that we find to be counterproductive and hurtful, I think is probably genuinely helpful. And again, for those who are like, oh, this is an in-house fight, they do that to us. Like, they make it as clear as they possibly can that they don't want to be affiliated with us. So they should be happy that this is taking place by definition.
We'll see what their response is when this comes out. And yes, right. I'm not doing a debate either. I'm not interested.
The heretics have said that I'm not one of them. Who could be upset?
Jonathon Van Maren is the communications director for the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform. Again, you can learn more about them by visiting endthekilling.ca. Jonathon, this has been great. You have just so much knowledge just to share about it. And I'm just really glad that you spent this time with us today. Thanks.
Yeah, no, really enjoyed it.